Srimad Bhagavatam. The translation of the text is, Lord Shiva continued, if one is hurt by the arrows of an enemy, one is not as aggrieved as when cut by the unkind words of a relative, for such grief continues to rend one's heart day and night. So the importance of sound vibration in our life, it cannot be underestimated. Just as we want to surround ourselves with positive sound vibration from the Shastra, from the devotees, chanting the holy name, connecting with Krishna through sound, we also want to be conscious of the adverse effects of sound in terms of harshness. So this is something that, as aspiring devotees, we want to rid from our lives, is harsh words, unkindness. Because, as Srila Prabhupada describes, natural psychology dictates that we can tolerate that to some degree when spoken by an enemy. Or if it's like if an enemy shoots arrows of harsh words at you. It hurts, but you can tolerate that. But as Lord Shiva is describing, when one is hurt by someone close, when those unkind words or harsh treatment come from a relative, and what does a relative mean? A relative means close relationship. Yes, so when someone in a close relationship with you shoots harsh words, the arrows of harsh words at you, that is very difficult to tolerate. You may be able to externally tolerate it, but inside, as Prabhupada says, we suffer the effects continually, day and night. It's a very painful situation when someone close to you hurts you with words, with harsh words. And it's very difficult to take it back. Once we let it out of our mouth in anger, then it's very difficult to retract that, because that sound vibration stays around and it stays in the other person's consciousness, in the other person's heart. So it makes there's big effects from what we speak. That's why we practice controlling the urge to speak, especially controlling the urge to speak under the influence of anger. When we're angry, don't speak. That was one of the, even though I'm definitely not very good at practicing it, I've done a few positive parenting courses, and one of the primary things that they say is when you are angry or when you hear yourself speaking harshly, just stop. Mid-sentence, doesn't matter where you are, just stop. Don't speak right now. Because you can teach lessons when you're calm, but you can't teach when you're angry. When you're angry, things come out in such a way that you regret it afterwards. And that's what we'll see happens with Shiva. After he received the goat's head, he expressed repentance. I shouldn't have done that. I shouldn't have spoken like that. So to avoid that consequence of having to regret our actions, we need to practice controlling the urge to speak, especially the urge to speak under the influence of anger. And we can see different examples in Shastra where this has happened, or different examples of how speech has caused such pain to the individual. And because we're heading up to Ram Navami, I was thinking of this in terms of Kaikeyi and how she spoke to Maharaj Dasara. Her request to Maharaj Dasara ended his life. He died because of that, Because of her words, what generally happens is words, they lead to action. Yes, so in the same way, Daksha's harsh words towards Shiva and that impact on Sati, it then leads to Sati ending her life. And in a similar vein, the words of Kaikeyi, when spoken to Maharaj Dasara, and then the effect of that Ram left, led to Maharaj Dasara giving up his life. He could no longer live. This is the effect of sound. This is the effect of not being able to control the urge to speak under the influence of anger or under a lower influence. Because we know with Kaikeyi, it's a really interesting situation with Kaikeyi actually. Because when she initially heard that Ram would be coronated, what was her response? Does anyone remember? She was happy. She was joyful. She was celebrating the coronation of Ram just like everybody else. She didn't have a feeling in her heart that, why isn't it Bharat? She didn't actually feel like that. But then under the influence, here's another example of harsh speech and how it affects. Under the influence of harsh words, of envious words from Manthara, from her servant maid, who was very close to her, almost as close as like a relative. They were extremely close. By those words spoken by Manthara, what happened to Kaikeyi? Her heart began to change. She came under the influence of this. She became convinced of Manthara's words, even though they were being spoken from a place of envy. Kaikeyi, who had never held in her heart a harsh feeling towards Ram, began to feel very hard towards him, and her heart began to change. So she became convinced by the words of Manthara that she should ask King Dasarath for these boons, that the 2 boons that he owed her because she saved his life once on the battlefield. That Ram would be banished to the forest for 14 years and Bharat would be crowned the emperor. And she became so fixed in that conviction that when her husband, the emperor of the world, came before her, she spoke harshly to him. When she hadn't spoken harshly to him before, she spoke harshly to him, and she demanded these boons. And he was absolutely devastated. His response, he was crying, he was on the ground, he was begging her on his knees, don't do this, I will give you anything else, anything, but not this. Don't ask for this, don't make me do this, don't force me to do this. And her heart, which had previously been full of love for her husband, was hardened, and she just called him harsh names and started threatening that, his whole honor and everything would be destroyed if he didn't give his wife the boons that he had promised her. She became so hardened. And why did this happen to her? Of course, we understand in the grand scheme of things it's the Lord's Leela. But we can see, for sake of instruction, we can see Manthara's involvement here, these words, how powerful is sound, that they can convince us of something that we have previously never even conceived of in our heart. We can be convinced. Sound is very, very powerful. And just as it was so powerful coming from Manthara to Kaikeyi, this demand of Kaikeyi to Dasarath, and he felt obliged, he felt so bound to say yes. He couldn't he couldn't refuse her. And so he agreed, and he banished Ram. And then he left his body, he left his world. And even at that time, his wife, Kaikeyi, was still under the influence of this envy, and these words of Manthara were still affecting her to such an extent that even her husband was dying and she was seemingly unaffected. It's just, the roll-on effects is just so intense, as Srila Prabhupada says. And it might sound to us a little bit like extreme, that just by words of a relative, then sometimes the injury becomes so intolerable that one commits suicide. But we see it actually happens. The power of words cannot be underestimated, of positive and then of negative also. So this is something that Srimad Bhagavatam is so wonderful that it instructs us on so many levels. It instructs us on just how to behave as a human being, how to reach the ultimate goal of devotional service to Krishna. And these little lessons that are there in the Bhagavatam are for us to improve the quality of our life or the quality of life of others. If we can just remember this. Lord Shiva teaching Sati that she's not going to be able to tolerate this. There are some things that, although we try, we may not be able to tolerate. And that the pain inflicted by one close to you is so much more painful than pain inflicted by an enemy. So how careful can we be that our words and actions don't inflict pain on other living entities? Because we don't know how much, like one kind of flippant, harsh word may actually affect somebody else in their heart, in their consciousness, so much so that it leads to these terrible effects that continually, day and night, we suffer this injury going around in our heart. And we see this, what happened with Sati, when she wasn't able to follow this instruction of Lord Shiva not to go, so she went, and she wasn't able to tolerate it. She couldn't tolerate that offense to Lord Shiva from her father. But so much so, that her words to Daksha they're really quite intense when we think about what she says to him, why she ended her life. And she said that, because my body has come from yours, I no longer want this connection to you, so therefore I will end my body. I just want to break all connection with you because of your offense, because of your harshness, because of your unkindness. I can't be connected with you anymore. This was the degree of pain that she felt by this offense towards her husband, by these harsh words, this pain inflicted by someone very close to you. Can just leave very terrible effects, actually. So in thinking about this part of this section, or this particular verse, I was reflecting for myself how important it is to control the urge to speak, to control that any kind of harsh words coming out from our mouth. That's our responsibility as a human being, as an aspiring devotee. We don't want anyone to be cut by our harsh words. So we can practice that. And Bhagavatam is so instructive, it just shows us all these little things, and then what can happen, the examples of what can happen in life if we come under the influence of these lower qualities pushed around by the lower modes of nature, and then if we respond, we're just reacting, then how much pain we can cause to other living creatures, how much pain we can cause to other living entities. And then on the flip side, as I mentioned, the importance of sound, the power of sound, that we want to connect with Krishna through sound. This is such a potent way of connection, just as the unkind words of someone churn around in the heart, words of encouragement, words of glorification, words of praise towards devotees and towards the Supreme Lord, then that goes around in the heart, doesn't it? And that can be very uplifting for other devotees in relationships. And Krishna becomes pleased when his devotee is pleased. We can offer Krishna kind words. We can offer Krishna our example. We could show Krishna how we're trying to apply these teachings. Krishna is so pleased with the effort of the devotee, and how the devotee takes the messages of the Bhagavatam, meditates on them, and actually really tries to apply them in life. So when Krishna sees that amongst devotees we're trying to work on relationships, we're trying to work on speech in such a way that it uplifts others, that it helps us come closer to Krishna, and we don't out of, anger or out of any of these lower pushings, we don't push people away from Krishna. Acting as Krishna's friend means we bring everyone to Krishna, because that's what Krishna wants. So if we treat everybody as Krishna's dear friend, then our words, our speech, our actions will reflect that. And then people will naturally feel encouraged to come closer to Krishna. Whereas if we're not careful and we fall, no one is perfect, But if we, come underneath these lower modes of nature regularly and we're hurting others by our speech, by our words, by our actions, then this is not pleasing to Krishna. And that brings people away from Krishna. When we often, it's very unfortunate, because and personally, if I see from my interactions with devotees who are maybe no longer practicing Krishna consciousness, the number one reason why they are not, I think that's accurate, the number one reason why they're not practicing is because there was some difficulty with devotees that they couldn't overcome, they couldn't tolerate. There's not so much, philosophical, or that they can't accept Krishna as the Supreme Lord. It's interpersonal friction. So we can all work on that, And these instructions by Lord Shiva to Sati, this is very relevant for us as well. That we don't want anybody to be put into this kind of situation from us. And also understanding ourselves that this degree of pain inflicted by someone close to us is very difficult to tolerate. It's very hard to tolerate. So let's not put anybody else into that situation. And instead work on the flip side to try to encourage and lift people up, because that's pleasing to Krishna, and that's our role in life, to please Krishna. Would anyone like to make some comments or ask a question? I'm short today.
Conditioning to realise that the main thing actually, on an intellectual level, the main thing is that I learn how not to treat others like that. But what's going on in my head is how that person treated me like that. Even obviously, even philosophically, I must have treated someone like that before that person treated me like that. But I can't get past the fact that on an emotional level, that person treated me like that. Not that it's necessarily the same person down south, but predominantly in the mind is how badly I was treated rather than how badly I treated others.
I've treated others. Yeah, that's true. It's definitely.
How do we actually get past that? Because ultimately you want to improve your own behaviour and not meditate so much on how other people treated me. So how can I get past that? Because it's hard to. Specifically doesn't know how to actually tolerate, because we're talking about internal toleration and external toleration, that we can tolerate externally. Internally we can't tolerate because we keep thinking about it.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, it's a good point. A couple of things I thought of. The first one is to have friends, have people around you that are not afraid to tell you when you hurt others. I think it's really underestimated. I had such a good friend for a very long time, like my best friend in Krishna consciousness, like 13 years. She would not always tell me, but she would tell me, you're being insensitive to this person, you're not speaking nicely to this one, you're that, you're that. But because of our intimate relationship, I never took it as a I never was upset with her for her telling me that. I was really grateful for her telling me because I couldn't see it, you know. But having someone reflect, someone that you trust, reflect back to you on your own behaviour and being able to accept that and then work on it, I think that's really valuable. Not that we only, you know, have friends who tell us how well we're doing, but actually we have friends who are not afraid to tell us where we need to work on, where we need improvement, because often it's hard to see for ourselves. But if you have someone who's able to shine the mirror and go, okay, look at you, you know, I love you, but this and this. And I think that's quite important. Yeah. And then how do we stop going over things that have happened to us and instead focus on how we treat others? I guess, as you said, you know, this is a real internal reflection. We have to really internally want to do that, you know, and actually pray to Krishna, pray to our spiritual master, please let me overcome this conditioning, because that's our conditioned nature. That's like, yes, we see what everyone else has done to me, but I can't really see what I'm doing to others. This is just part of our conditioning, you know. So we can pray to Krishna, please help me overcome this conditioning. Please, I want to be able to see myself clearly. And, you know, we can meditate on these verses of Lord Chaitanya that we offer all respects to others and not expect respect for ourselves. Like actually try and deeply imbibe this kind of mood, like, okay, Krishna, you know, I really want to work on this. If we identify it as something I want to work on, then, you know, pray around it, really work on it, surround yourself with, you know, confidential friends who are going to help you work on it. And in that way I think we have a little chance, a little opportunity to work on it. Anything else you think, Haripriya? That's such a humble position, Haripriya. That's wonderful. Yeah, how would it be if we, you know, accept the arrows of insults and see that as a reflection of our humble position and just take shelter of the devotees to try to continue on with enthusiasm? That's a very, very humble position. We may not, you know, we may not immediately be able to come to that position, but definitely. I was just, when you were speaking, I was remembering there's this book written about Hladini Mataji, the Srila Prabhupada's disciple. Hladini Mataji, yes, you know this book. And she gives an example there about chastisement and how to take it. And she said, you know, it's like if somebody comes in, say they come into the kitchen and they start shouting and, oh, it's such a mess, why you're useless and all of this stuff, and look at all this rubbish here, take that rubbish out of here, and get onto you in that way. She said, in that way it's natural to want to rebel, like, oh, you know, why is someone treating me so harshly? But on the other side, she said, if somebody comes in and says, oh, you've done such wonderful service and you cook so nicely, and the only thing I can see is that overflowing rubbish bin there, so maybe you could take out the rubbish. And she says, well, that kind of approach makes us more willing to accept that there's something at fault. But she said, this was her exalted nature, she said, I just try to see what Krishna wants. Take out the rubbish, regardless of how it's presented to me. You know? So that's an intense level of humility and understanding that, you know, what does Krishna want me to learn in this situation? What does Krishna want me to hear in this situation? Whether it's being fired at me nicely or fired at me harshly, what does Krishna want me to see? How can my response to this please Krishna? So that's the very high level of understanding it. Yeah. Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai, Srila Prabhupada ki jai, Tagore Premanandi, Hari Hari Bol.